Hello, everyone. Kelly Deutsch here, and today I am joined by Tim Burnette. And I'm excited about our conversation because Tim is the founder and curator of the Way Collective, which is a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. He's a freelance writer, a process philosopher, theologian, and Disciples of Christ minister. He believes that through grounding our lives in loving communities, a shared practice and values, that we can work for love together and help our society achieve liberation toward the common good. Now, I've been curious and intrigued, Tim, by what you're up to, because it's not too often that you'll find something that is like church, but not quite church, and that's contemplative in a group that's in an established kind of setting. And so I'm curious to hear about all of that and how that started. But before we get there, I'm curious just a little bit about your story and how you went from wherever you started in your, I'm assuming Christian walk, but I'd love to hear, where you grew up with all of that to where you are now in this contemplative community.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kelly. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
My story's sort of meandering. You were right. I did grow up in a Christian household. My dad was a pastor and grew up in a pretty sort of conservative Christian house. And then, let's see, in college, ended up spending some time in some more Pentecostal circles. And after that, I spent about 9 years in the Presbyterian Church USA. And so now I work with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So there is, I call myself sometimes just like a theological mutt, there's a mishmash of a lot of things going on. But definitely, throughout all of that, I would say that my journey of faith has been one in which there's been a continual emergence of contemplative rhythms as something that has been fruitful and grounding. Yeah, I mean, there's a longer story there. I don't know how much you want me to unpack, but definitely, I would consider myself still being in the Christian tradition. It's just gotten much wider than I first thought, when I began the journey. So
yeah, would you share a little bit about that widening process? Because I think a
yeah.
lot of our listeners have gone through something like that, where whether it's through deconstruction or just crisis or something happens and it kind of blew apart the faith or religion that they grew up with. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that process.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that I think that is well said and sort of indicates my own story too. But yeah, so like I said, I was working in a Presbyterian church. I had started seminary because I enjoyed ministry and loved learning. And so in the midst of this process of ideological deconstruction, where you're always having to integrate new theologies, new perspectives, I also had this existential moment of getting diagnosed with cancer in the middle of that journey. And so amidst this world of changing ideas I was trying to integrate, I had this sort of deep experience of my own finitude and mortality, and pretty quickly began carrying an entirely new set of questions that I found out were not super welcome at the seminary I was at, and nor were they really super welcome in the church I was working in, and let alone some other, relational spheres of my life. And so I had to find a new conversation at the time. And yeah, I found a really beautiful circle of wise and expansively minded folks to be with. And so it really came out of this experience of deep suffering that I was carrying all new questions about the nature of God and cosmology, and then also the nature of like what would be maybe something like missiology or the mission of the church, or what's the Jesus movement supposed to be yielding? Because pretty quickly my sort of social values transitioned. And so love became a really important center. And what did that mean? And how do Christians parse that out? And so for me, yeah, it was birthed out of this moment of trying to integrate this experience of cancer and chemotherapy and theology and cosmology. And so, yeah, I found myself in crossing, one of like what John O'Donohue calls those threshold moments in our life, where you step into a new place and everything's different. And then how do you adjust when you're there, and how do you find your people, and how do you, you know what I mean? How do you connect to the sacred canopy that you're given? And like I said earlier, that it sort of had the canopy had to widen a bit for me to still find myself within. But there's a little insight there into some of the cause of that deconstructive moment for me that then had a ripple effect for a number of years. And still, I think for the rest of my life will likely be integrating that. So
yeah, I'm curious to pause there and look at that a little bit, because as I think I shared a little bit with you before, I went through my own cancer and illness and suffering, having that being blown apart. And I found that I felt like Saint Francis, when he had that night where he spent all night in front of, the Eucharist and the chapel, and he was like, "Who am I, God, and who are you?" And he just kept asking that over and over and over, "Who am I and who are you?" And I felt like that was where I was in illness, because everything was taken away. And so it was the three big questions of like, what's my identity? Where do I belong? And how am I supposed to serve? What do I do now? And so I'm curious how suffering for you cracked those open. Like, what was the connection point between I have cancer and I'm going through chemo to like, now my social values have to do with love? Like, can you build that bridge a little bit?
yeah, I think for me, just to be transparent, a lot of it revolved around God. And so the tradition I inherited was one in which we call in theology the big O God, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, right? All the things that most of us are not, you know what I mean? And with that sort of understanding, especially the way in which power is parsed out in that kind of a theology, divine power, there becomes a real problem of evil, or a problem of suffering. Sometimes it's called theodicy. And the rote answers that I was being given in seminary and in part of the little corner of the Christian tradition I was in didn't help me make sense of my suffering, didn't really help me integrate what I was learning and what I was going through. And to be honest, just sounded like a pretty horrible explanation for what God was like. And so for me, it sort of looking for other options, looking for a more contemporary cosmology within which to have a theology, was really important, because I realized I didn't want to say anything about God that didn't have to do with the world we were living in, which I was experiencing to be one that was full of pain in a deep way. And so for me, I gravitated toward, I just sort of stumbled, happenstance into this school of thought called process thought. And it has all these beautiful sort of non-coercive ways of talking about God and God's love. And so when I found out that we could have a theology without power being the primary trait, or sort of like a kind of like omnipotence sort of philosophically means that nobody else has power, right? If you're all powerful, no one else can have agency. So, which is where we get a lot of sort of determinist theologies from. But when I found that we could have a God whose nature was love, and that love was uncontrolling and non-coercive, I found a place for myself to continue on the faith journey that I had begun. And so that love then gets parsed out socially, right? To how do we have human relationships? How do we have relationships to the environment? What is a loving response to people who are consistently marginalized by our government and by our churches? And so that sort of God question being transformed, and that cosmology, that new understanding of the world and of the universe had very real embodied implications for how we should live as non-coercive, loving presences in the world. So for me, that was like it all kind of happened at once, or as a process at once, like of this this deeper integration into the notion of love and what it means to invite, the common good in our world. And so that was kind of the connection point for me.
Yeah.
God was the glue,
Yeah. And I love how incarnational that is, because it's one thing to just have an intellectual revolution, if you will, but when it really does change the way that you're living and deciding to make your choices day to day, or who you count amongst your friends, all of that.
Yeah.
You mentioned, you were able to find some folks in these wider spaces, people who are expansively minded. And I'm curious how that happened, because I know a lot of folks who go through a process of deconstruction, falling apart, that's really difficult. Even when you do make it into this reconstruction space of like finding curiosity and that spark returns, it's still hard to find community with others who are in a similar space. So how did that happen for you?
Well, I was very fortunate, I feel like, to stumble into a Rob Bell 2-day event down in Laguna Beach when he was still living down there. And through that event and a couple of other relationships that I built locally down in like the LA, Southern California area, I just found a really quickly, again, fortunately, a new set of conversation partners who were doing theology from this other perspective. One of the other early influences for me was something called Homebrewed Christianity, which is a podcast I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but Tripp is one of my best buds. And and Bo Sanders too, were a couple of people I found really early. And, we just got to spend a lot of significant time together pressing into this process, not only of deconstruction and like, sort of the French school of philosophy there, continental philosophy, but even to like, what does it mean to be a Christian now? What's the reconstruction look like? So a bunch of folks down in sort of Southern California area welcomed me in, and I feel very, very grateful to have found them, because it was a very isolating experience. As I think a lot of people, when they start deconstructing, are like, wait a minute, I don't fit in my church. I may not fit in the seminary I'm in. I might not fit in my life group or my friend group or my family, especially sometimes. And you almost have to traverse the wild on your own. I'll grab this podcast, I'll read this book, I'll just kind of go down the internet wormhole of references until I can find some ideas that are still inspiring for me. But so there was luckily a small group of folks who were around down there that embraced me, and the rest is history, as they say. So
yeah. As you connected with all of these conversation partners and people in these wider spaces, what eventually led to you forming this space that you have now, this contemplative community that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds something like post-church, like you don't have to be Christian, you can be Christian, but has some shared values together. Like, how did that come about?
It came about primarily because what was becoming more and more evident over time was that the church I was working at the time was not a great fit anymore, I think, for both of us. And so I had this heart to have a space that was available for those of us who were sort of sojourning on our own in the ways I mentioned earlier. And, the emergent church had been doing things like this for a long time in their own ways. And there's not much that we're doing that's that different from that, other than sort of naming the contemplative option and doing this community of shared practices and values aspect rather than belief centric community. So, but honestly, it was just like, it was the space I wished existed when I was going through what I was going through. And it's been my experience continually up to this day that there aren't a lot of spaces like this for folks in different regions of the country and of the world. Like I was listening to some friends talk this week on a podcast, and they said the number one question they get asked, they have pretty large audiences. The number one question they get asked is, where can I go? Like I don't fit in my church anymore. I don't have anywhere to go. And so we're trying to, the community that is here now, we're trying to make this space together, you know. And I think it's been a beautiful experiment in what community could look like, or post-church community, you know, contemplative community. But it's just trying to meet that need where there's a common space where you can be wherever you are and keep journeying in local community together, rooted in love and working for love together in the world. So
yeah, I loved on your website you had written that you can't unbelieve your way out of our community, which I think a lot of people could find both shocking but also incredibly refreshing. You know, that beliefs aren't the center of this. And how does that work out? I mean, I have to imagine that there are people there who have a diversity of opinions and beliefs.
They do. Wouldn't you know it? Isn't that so fascinating? Human beings, they're all different. You know what I mean?
Imagine that.
It works out. I don't know how to explain it. I would say the one aspect I think that's been really helpful to allow for that spectrum to exist is we do have a set of practices and values that people, you sort of like, to come to our community, you're like, I want to live into these, you know? And so there's still that binding agent of that, like, historically maybe like a creed or a belief set has played, but for us it's like we want these qualities to be reflected in the way that we live. And that allows, I mean, I think it sort of naturally or innately gives people permission to allow their beliefs to be where they are, you know. And so it gets messy sometimes, but it's not really been an issue. In fact, one of the funny kind of aspects was I was working with a friend of mine to draw up like our relationship to the Christian story and how our community is going to do this. We drew this like expansive sort of picture of like evolutionary history and like 13.9 billion years and all this kind of stuff. And this is what it, like the Jesus stuff is about. And our community was like, we presented at a retreat and our community was like, no, we don't really need that. So for whatever reason, it's worked for them to just commit to this path. We say that we sort of engage with Christianity through stories, symbols, sacraments, and sacred days. So again, you know, more alliterations, but it's pretty easy for people to kind of see like, oh yeah, many of us have this common language, this common history with Christianity. And so we're not going to just like throw the baby out with the bathwater and just get rid of the whole thing. What we can do is embrace, the other thing we say is those loving and liberating parts of our tradition, and keep at those together and realize that there's not a coercive element here in Christianity. There's only the invitation to love and this path that we're on. And it's just worked out that people who can see that and they want to participate in something like that have come, you know, to be a part of it.
Do people find the Way Collective because they're looking for like contemplative community, or just because they're looking for something open-minded or something else?
All the above, I would say. I think it's, for some people, the contemplative thread is interesting. For some people, it's really not. And they are more into the liberatory aspect of it, you know, or the social sort of justice aspect of it. For others, it's just like a safe space when you don't know what you think anymore about Christianity, to come and hang out and have dinner and have a conversation and meditate a little bit. Like it's, I think people sort of span that gap from deconstruction to reconstruction, from more social praxis to contemplative, and everywhere in between.
Yeah, I find that such an interesting kind of gathering when people who can be so diverse, and not only, you know, in themselves and their backgrounds, but where they find themselves spiritually. I mean, you know, welcome to humanity. That's, you know, there is such diversity, but finding unity without expecting uniformity.
Yeah.
That's
where it's at.
That's the key, but it's not always easy.
No, I couldn't agree with that more. It's Yeah, we're still learning all the time. We're still holding new depths, new spaces of difference, and
Hmm.
I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. I think we're going to have to keep sort of widening our circle, keep being more intentional about our language, keep drawing our practices as a community forward to, yeah, to really become that together. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm. What would you say is something presently that has been capturing your attention or even the attention of the Way Collective as far as like where you feel drawn presently in the context of where life is,
Mm.
pandemic, all the unrest that has been happening over the past few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so expansive. It's hard to pick one avenue. I think that, as I just mentioned, we're really, I think, making this space together and experimenting with what it looks like to hold difference in a community.
Hmm.
And difference takes a lot of forms and shapes, from political to race to sexual orientation, gender identity to beliefs. Like there's so much, class. And one of the one of the aspects we've been endeavoring into lately that just happened a few weeks ago was we did this contemplative pause moment where I had people write down on some anonymously on pieces of paper what's one thing, what's one opinion or belief that you hold that you don't feel comfortable sharing at Way Collective, because as any community does, we've got a center of gravity. We probably lean a certain way politically, lean a certain way theologically, and not everybody's like all right at the same space. And so I read all these statements, and some of them were contradicting each other, like, and people had to just sort of sit in a posture of welcome to all that. And it was pretty cool because it started a new sort of series of conversations around, wow, I didn't know we had such, I mean, capitalism was one thing that came up, and it was like we had somebody say, I believe in the free market and I'm not a demon and I care about poor people. And we had other people say, another person said, I think if Jesus saw what's happening in late capitalism, he'd give up nonviolence, right? So I actually had to read those statements back to back. And so, but that's an honest reflection of what exists in our community.
Hmm.
And we're all still for our practices and values. So I guess it's an illustration to answer your question, which is, I think we're going to be learning into belonging for a long time.
Hmm.
And especially coming out of the pandemic, the ways that we've been isolated and forced into digital connections in ways that are, both positive and negative, and the othering that's happening in our society right now, and how do we find local communal responses to that, I think is kind of what I've become really interested in, is how can we hold that space at Way Collective. And we're gonna, yeah, like I said, we're having a retreat later this fall where I think we're gonna process some of that as a community, and just kind of press into what it looks like to become that. And to, again, this is just another aspect of hopefully love, casting out all fear, because I think a lot of our division and our othering and our lack of belonging is due to, some form of fear manifesting. And so yeah, it's like I said, I think I'm learning alongside everybody too about what it looks like. But
Yeah.
yeah, but it's been fun to start to journey toward that.
I love how real that is.
Yeah,
Just
yeah, yeah.
because it's so easy to surround ourselves by people who are similar. I mean, that's one thing
Mm-hmm.
that we long for, obviously. I want to find kindred spirits who I can share and resonate with on some deep level. But when
Yeah,
we get stuck in our little echo chambers, it can be, we almost forget how to speak with people who are different, who, one person who values the free market and the other person who, is pretty
yeah,
sure that capitalism is from the devil or something,
yeah,
where,
yeah.
and how do we see each other as human beings,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just, like, oh, he's a liberal, she's a conservative, or
Yeah.
I'm thinking of someone that I spoke with the other day, and she's a lesbian. She and her wife were out for a walk and they lost their dog in a park.
Oh
And she
no.
said that she's like, you know what? Labels are so just surface level because a family wearing MAGA hats came up and like helped us find our dog,
Mm.
And she's like,
Wow.
in any other context, like this would, like, we would not have crossed paths. We would not have interacted probably much at all. But to
Mm.
see that these people are still like caring human beings, even if they hold
Mm.
completely different, worldviews than we do. But it makes such a difference when you just meet Joe versus you meet, oh, here, meet my friend who's a liberal, meet my friend who's bi, meet my friend who's,
Right.
whatever. And you start with a label instead of just
Mm-hmm.
seeing each other. And I think that's one of the gifts of community is first you have a relationship and
Mm-hmm.
then you can start to learn about all of the other
Yeah.
bits and pieces of our views and differences.
Yeah. I mean, we do contain multitudes, right? Like we're so much more than even our intersectional identity markers would reflect. I love that, like, this sort of image of like our identity not being equivalent to our biography or our history, and but the hard reality of that is that we also have these parts of ourselves that when they're public or they're political, which is kind of what that word means, they can harm other people, and so how do we not be reduced to one aspect of our identity or perhaps our political opinion or something like that, and then also how do we create relationships and frames for being in community that mitigate harm, and that have a focus on impact, and so yeah, it becomes much more complex than any one of our sort of you know identity markers could capture, but it's part of the challenge of our time, I think, too, on a large scale level. So
Right. Yeah. And I like the idea that contemplative practice really is a practice. Like we are practicing basically an inner stance, of that
mm-hmm.
receptivity. And I like how that exercise that you shared of everybody writing their essentially unpopular opinion, and having everybody have to hold that same stance, like of welcoming,
Mm-hmm.
of receptivity, and not immediately jumping into judgment or condemnation or whatever it is, but to just let it be what it is, which is so difficult because, I mean, in our day to day lives, we always want to form these quick snap judgments about, like, oh man, like, I feel sick today, or it's raining and I plan to go on a hike. And immediately we think this is bad instead of just
Mm-hmm.
letting it be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
yeah, those practices, man. Like,
Yeah, I think it's important to keep an intention, and it doesn't have to look any one way, but you're right. I think that inner stance is vital for us to move from our resources rather than our reactivities in this kind of a world where everything is so, I mean, we were just using this word the other day, but everything is so, what's it called? Gosh, I can't think of it right now. Yeah, but everything is so inflammatory, like
mm-hmm.
it's meant to get a reaction from us, and we're wired, we are hardwired to react, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
and especially fight or flight and all that good stuff, but how do we cultivate that inner intention and posture is so, I mean, so necessary right now.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you said it before. I think it's the safety too, like being able to be in a place and especially a community where we feel safe because that's also part of our wiring, is to be able to co-regulate with other people. It's, how
Mm,
many people tell me like, "Oh my gosh, it's just so different to meditate in a group. Like it's just so
yeah.
much easier." It's like, yeah, because our nervous systems are built that way. If you bring
Mm,
a depth of presence, like our nervous systems work like tuning forks, to be able to just be like,
yeah.
oh, thank you. You're just drawing me into that presence, and my whole system kind of down regulates into this
Mm,
state of
mm,
being. It's such a
yeah,
lovely
it's
thing.
beautifully put.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. So vital.
What's your favorite contemplative practice?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's probably a result of this communal effort, but I'm trying to, as much as possible, think of contemplation more in terms of the everyday. Uh, and by that, I don't mean one particular practice, like centering prayer, which I definitely gravitate towards. I wrote my dissertation on, like, I like centering prayer, but I don't do it that often comparatively to like going for walks at the beach, or trying not to be reactive when my kids are bugging me, or you know what I mean, like, or getting into having to deal with conflict at work, or you know what I mean, like there's like myriad opportunities for me to be contemplative. And so for me, I think like what you named, this inner posture has become really important to find ways to bring it into the everyday rhythms that I try to keep. I do take a fair amount of time for silence and solitude, which I'm like I've got Enneagram 4 tendency type person. So for me, that's just me going like, I'm going to unplug. So I do that fairly often, but it's not always like Tim's out meditating in the wilderness. It's like, no, I'm walking on the beach, just processing whatever I need to process through that day to be more grounded or be more centered. And, so it looks a lot of different ways. So I'm sorry that it's not more of a clear answer, but I think even when we try to teach contemplation at Way Collective and help other folks, that our phrase is like ground our lives in love for the work of love. I mean, that just practicing that sort of loving and kind attention toward your own thoughts and emotions and feelings is what we're really talking about. So that perspective becomes more deeply integrated and more natural, so that we become less reactive. And so, yeah, I think it just takes an awareness and a level of intentionality that I try to carry with me as often as I possibly can. And so
I love that, because I mean, that's why I like that we call these things a practice, because I mean, just like any instrument, doing your scales, it's like the point is not the scales, like the point is so that you have that ability to play or to respond in life without reacting with that snap judgment or whatever it is. We've practiced that interior stance enough that when you are going for a walk in the beach, or your kids are being a little crazy or something, you can return to that because you've practiced it so frequently, whether it is, in centering prayer or something else. But I love finding those moments and being present and aware enough that you can carry that throughout the day.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think our buddy Jim Finley says it beautifully, just to say like, have an intention or a time every day where there's no agenda but love, that kind of a thing. And, that inner stance of least resistance and all the phrasings that he might use there. I think that's where it's at, because we so often default to whatever our thing might be, judgmentalism or shame or anxiety or anger or cynicism or disdain. Like there's so much that's in the air, even just like in terms of our media relations, social media and news outlets, that it's like we've all taken on that spirit on some level. And so having this sort of like time to exorcise those energies that we don't want to carry with us into our relationships and our work, like we got to do it. We got to do it,
Yeah, it really does take intentionality, which is why I think there is such a prolific number of practices that people are like, try this, use your mantra, try meditating, focus on your breathing, do yoga, try, and those are all wonderful. It's like, but yeah, similarly, when people ask, like what practice do you recommend, or what's your favorite practice, and it is often just like, find what grounds you. Like, I don't care if it is sipping your coffee in the morning or riding horseback, like find what it is and, make your agenda love, presence, receptivity.
Yep. I think that's it.
Yeah. If you had to offer one piece of wisdom, insight, advice to folks who are perhaps early on in this contemplative journey? Maybe they've been through some sort of deconstruction. The idea of contemplation, mysticism intrigues them. What would you recommend? Like, how would people get started? Or if they showed up to the Way Collective and they said, "Hey, Tim, I'm intrigued by this. I don't really know much about it or what it is. Where do I get started?"
So I wrestle with this, right? Because I think I'll just say from experience here at Way Collective, we've got folks who are like really into contemplation and they're going to meditate, and like we've got people who are just like, all about that. And we've got people who like couldn't care less about centering prayer, but like the idea of being for love and liberation. And so for me, like the first thing that came to mind when you asked that question is, I would say to somebody who's beginning to inquire of the contemplative path or the inner life in a new depth, I would say everything is an invitation to go deeper into love. Everything you encounter, a big roadblock, a big trauma, like whatever the thing might be that you run into that you're like, this can't possibly be a part of it. It's part of it, And so for me, like starting to see whatever comes through your psyche, through your soul, as an invitation to be welcomed in loving kindness and integrated into ultimately surrendered to love. Again, we already talked about the practice side of this. We do this in myriad ways, but I think for me, I wish somebody would have told me that whatever you're about to encounter, whatever maybe dark night you're going to go through, whatever you're losing, it's all a part of this journey of falling deeper into, union with love. But it just doesn't feel that way. It doesn't always feel that way. It feels like somebody's pruning something, to use the John image, but it feels like death a lot of the time. It feels like suffering. It feels like hurt. It feels like re-traumatizing sometimes. It feels like loss, grief. But I always go back to this quote by a psychologist named Bruce Rogers Wan. He says that grief is really just love under the condition of absence. Grief is love under the condition of absence. And so for me, everything we encounter, like no matter how drastic the bodily experience or the emotional experience, no matter how hard line the storylines are that we create around what all of that means for us, all of it is just it's an invitation to go deeper into love and to surrender in a new place. I think that's kind of the whole path for me. So I got lots of time left to keep letting go, you know what I mean? But I don't know. I think that's kind of, it starts to eradicate the fear around, well, can this part of me be included, or can love really be the widest horizon, in my infinite inner life, so. Yeah.
Well, right. Especially when your outer life presents you with so many difficulties, and I mean, this is kind of coming back to the beginning of our conversation, just the problem of suffering and what do we do with all of the pain, and how can we possibly see this as part of the path? That's a difficult thing to embrace. But when you do recognize that love is the widest horizon, there's something so freeing about that.
Yeah. I mean, that back to the theology thing for me too, the God idea, like there's a lot of suffering that has to be in a wider horizon for that to even be true. And that's hard to swallow, I think, like there's not just our personal individual experiences of suffering, but like as, Dr. Barbara Holmes has been writing about in her last book, Crisis Contemplation, like there's communal trauma, there's global trauma that we're going through. And so that horizon of love has to keep getting a little wider and a little wider to hold or embrace all that this universe throws at us. And that does something to how you think about ultimate reality about God, and it does something to love, I think, too, and it's really important.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. As we wind down our conversation, what would be a question that you would like to leave with our audience?
The first one that comes to mind is, do you want to be free? And by that, I sort of am implying that we're not. Societally, I'm really talking about, I think sitting with that question is really important, because it can start to catalyze and lead us out of the systems and the relations that we're sort of naturally tangled up in, that are not freeing and giving us life and opening us up for more beauty and more life. And it'll start to expose those, if you really sit with that question. I mean, I think of it politically, sociologically, economically. I think of it holistically in terms of even like care and basic needs. And there's a lot that, if you really sit with the question, like, do you want to be free? Do we as a society want to be free? That I think will become unveiled,
Yeah. And I agree that the union of the inner and the outer, there's if you want to work for justice, go home and love your family, like to start with the things that are most immediate, and not to neglect, obviously, the systemic and the global. And, I mean, we absolutely need to work for those, but there's so much inner work that needs to happen as well, for us to truly be free.
Yeah, Dorothy Zilla, liberation theologian, said that, one of her goals in her work was to try to erase the distinction between the mystical internal and the political external. And I think that's just it. I mean, I think you and I spoke briefly when we first connected about, the ways in which it's almost as if the dark night of the soul maps over sort of disentangling from sort of late capitalist relations. And, we're all subjects under late capitalism. So there's this, wow, if we really want to be free and start to disentangle from some of the things that are actually working against us, and especially oppressing those who have historically been marginalized in our society, like, you're going to go through a lot of dark night type stuff. You're going to have a really committed, contemplative posture of love. But I do think that, like you said, it's sort of that you will be liberated both internally, and our society will come to further and further freedom if we can press in. So
beautiful. Well, I appreciate you sharing some of your story, and also positing some of these questions, like what does it mean to be free, and do you really want it?
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much for sharing this space and allowing me to be a partner in conversation. So
yeah, absolutely. And Tim, if people want to find out more about you or the Way Collective, where should they go?
Yeah, they could go to waycollective.org. Or .com will also point you there. If you want to see a little bit about who we are also upping our social media presence a little bit, so you could find us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And me, I'm just at TD Burnette on Twitter for the most part. I Instagram at TD Burnette also a little bit. And yeah, but I've got some articles on Medium. I don't write very often these days because I've got my, hands in the dirt over here. But yeah, or if you want to reach out, feel free to shoot me an email.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing, and thank you everyone for joining us.